Mark chapter 6 is probably my favorite chapter in the Bible. That's because we're going through Mark. If we're covering a different book, I'll change my mind at that point. But Mark 6 has always been a favorite of mine because Mark has a sermon to preach, and he's brilliant at it. And this is one of the chapters that shows his brilliance. You know that each of the gospel writers has their own sermon to preach. I made this point when we began the series. A great example is to compare stories. For example, take a look sometime at the baptism story of Jesus being baptized. Okay. Mark tells it very basic. He says that the heavens were opened and the voice from heaven says, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." Very basic stuff. Mark turns out to be a pretty basic gospel, getting straight to the heart. Now, he does say the heavens are ripped apart. That's his word that he uses 3 times in the Gospel of Mark. First time's there. Second time is a few chapters later where he says you don't put new wine in old wineskins. It'll rip open. And then the third time is when Jesus dies on the cross and the veil of the temple is ripped from top to bottom. So in that story, very basic, he still finds a way to put in a word to tell you, here's something I'm doing. The heavens are ripped open, just as the veil's going to get ripped at the end, and it's a sign that the separation between God and humanity is gone. It gets ripped open when the God-man Jesus accepts his mission, and it gets ripped open when he fulfills his mission. Okay, if you're reading Matthew's version, Matthew says that as Jesus was coming down to be baptized, John the Baptist says, "Time out." That's my version. Time out. He says, wait a second. I need to be baptized by you, not me baptize you. And Jesus says, no. We've got to fulfill all righteousness. Matthew's the only gospel that tells us that story. Well, it's interesting. Wouldn't you know it, the word righteousness appears in Matthew more than any other book. 2 chapters later, Jesus is going to say, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. It is very important for Matthew to make the point that righteousness matters to God. And so he tells us that at the baptism, Jesus wanted to fulfill all righteousness. It's a true story that Matthew tells us because it fits with the point he's trying to preach, which is that Jesus is a man of righteousness. Okay. In Luke's gospel, Luke says, interestingly enough, that, Jesus comes down to be baptized and all that. And it says, and while he was praying, the heavens opened. Luke's the only one that tells us that at his baptism, Jesus was praying. He throws that in there. Well, wouldn't you know it? In Luke's gospel, Jesus prays at every major moment of his life. And Luke is trying to say in his gospel, Jesus is a praying servant. Everything he does, he makes sure that he's following the will of God. And that's a very important point to Luke. What I'm trying to get at is if you look at how each gospel writer tells their story, you'll learn something about the sermon that gospel writer is trying to preach. Mark 6, this is a sermon and a half. I mean, this is good. This will preach. And the points that are being made, I really hope and pray, are Mark's points and not mine. And so let's see if we can bring those out. Let's start at the end of the chapter. There's a lot packed in here. Let's start in verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Do the other gospel writers say this? Yes, almost word for word. And then Mark adds a line that no other gospel writer adds. and he intended to pass by them. Have you ever noticed that line before? He intended to pass by them. Have you ever had a moment in your life when it felt like God was passing by you? You remember the story, I'm sure, very well. West Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. One-room Amish schoolhouse. A man named Carl Roberts backed up his truck, came out armed to the teeth, walked into a one-room schoolhouse of Amish children, aged 9 to 13, lined them up against the chalkboard, and then shot them execution style before killing himself. Carl Roberts was a milk truck driver, not Amish. 9 years before that, he had prayed and prayed and prayed for a child. And God answered his prayer. And a child was born and lived for 20 minutes and then died. And Carl never forgave God for that. Are there moments in your life when it feels like God is passing by? Carl Roberts felt that way. That's why he did what he did. And you can imagine that everyone in the world assumed that is how the Amish community was going to feel that day. What happens when you pray and pray for God to do something good and wonderful in your life, and instead it feels like he passes by? There's a story, 2 stories before this, John the Baptist. Could that be a story of similar background? John the Baptist had spent his life serving God. He had put his life on the line in the sense that, he was considered an outcast by so many people. He's out there in the desert. He looks weird. He's eating weird, and he's trying to preach a message that's difficult for people to hear. He even looked the king in the eye and said, listen, you don't have the right to be with the person you're with. And it turns out that he was actually respected because nobody ever talks to the guy in charge that way. But here he is in prison. Here he is in prison. And of course, he knows who Jesus is. He's baptized his cousin Jesus, and he's looking forward to the kingdom. And he's in prison. And you know that he's looking up to heaven and he's asking God for deliverance. And he hears, maybe through the grate, through the wall and through the roof, he hears, ask me anything you want and I'll give it to you, up to half my kingdom. But it's not God talking to him. It's the king talking to his daughter, who's done a little dance, and he's got a big party, and he's trying to impress his crowd, and he says, I want to give you something, and he probably does it in a way to kind of show off his ability to give great things in front of all of his guests. So he says, you ask for it, I'll give it to you. And she runs back and talks to her mom, and her mom says, you should go ask for the head of John the Baptist. Don't you think, as John bows his head for the last time, the thought might occur to him, I thought he was going to come and deliver me. Feels like he's passing me by. When his disciples have to come and take his body and bury him, maybe they felt that way. There are very, very difficult moments in life, and it's easy to assume that that's what's happening. Mark has a very special message if that's how you feel, now or ever. It's a good message to keep in mind. Ecclesiastes says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come. In other words, when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the middle of the storm and the wind's against you, everything's cloudy. It's not a great time to be developing a faith. You need one to sustain you in those moments. And that's what Mark wants to do. So let's back up. The beginning of chapter 6, the reader of Mark assumes he knows or she knows what's going to happen because it begins like so many other stories in Mark. In fact, it begins almost exactly like something in the middle of Mark chapter 1. And that is on the Sabbath, he begins to teach in the synagogue, and many who hear him are astonished and say, "Where did this man get these sayings?" That's exactly what they say in Mark chapter 1. He goes into the synagogue, he begins to preach, the people are amazed. Although there it ends with them excited and interested in following and learning. But here it says that it's his own hometown. And they respond after being amazed with, "Wait a second. Isn't this Joe's kid?" Joseph, but they probably called him Joe. "Isn't this Joe's kid? I mean, didn't my kid go to school with him? This is the son of Mary and the brother of James and Judas and Simon. These are his sisters." And the text says they took offense at him. And one of the strangest verses in the Bible, verse 5, Jesus, the Son of God, the miracle-working, power-filled Son of God, could do no miracle there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. You ever thought what it takes to amaze Jesus? Must take a lot. There's only 2 times in the Gospels that Jesus is amazed. The first time he's amazed when an outsider, non-Jew, shows incredible faith. And Jesus is listening to someone from the outside basically say, "You just speak the word." And Jesus, the text says, was amazed at his faith. And here, in his own hometown, with the people who know him best or should know him best, he's amazed at their lack of faith. Mark's first point is that the people who are going to have the hardest time understanding his message are the people from Jesus' hometown who should know him best. This is not a challenging message for outsiders. This is a challenging message for insiders, or those who think of themselves as insiders, like me. Okay. So I need to be on guard. I need to be aware that what he wants to do can't be done if I'm not open to it. So let's look at verses 7 through 13, and let's see this first vignette. Jesus sends out the 12 apostles. And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff and to wear sandals. Let me stop here. During World War II, there was so much destruction and devastation throughout Europe that when it was all over, and most of the people were dancing in the streets with excitement that it's all over, there was work to do. There were children without parents all over Europe. And the Red Cross went in and collected all these children and put them in camps. And as you can imagine, the kids had trouble sleeping. How do we put them to sleep? And one nurse had an idea. She said, "Let's put a loaf of bread in every one of their hands." And I don't know if the bread acted like a doll, so you feel a sense of security. I don't know if it's because some of them had actually tried to find a way to feed themselves on the streets, and this assured them they'd have bread tomorrow. But whatever it was, it worked. A loaf of bread in every hand gave them a sense of peace. We still use the word bread to symbolize security and peace. I mean, I don't know if we still say it, but I know for a while the phrase was when you go to work to bring home the dough, you're bringing home the bread. And when you pass by fresh baked bread, that smell reminds you of security, safety, warmth, and home. And I think there's a metaphor here. And if I was going to title Mark's sermon, the title would be, Who Provides Your Bread? Of course, we don't mean just necessarily who's going to feed you, although that's part of it. It's when you are facing issues in life. Are you relying on your own strength? Are you trusting your own ingenuity? Or are you letting God provide? Who is it who really provides the bread in your life? In this first story, we're going to see the word bread in verse 8. Notice, he sends them out and he charges them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bag, no money, and no bread. He wants to try to teach them that as they go from house to house, as they go day to day, he wants them to learn how to rely on God and God alone. So he says, don't take food for tomorrow. I will provide for today. It actually is meant to remind you of the Old Testament. Remember when the children of Israel left Egypt and they were in the wilderness, God said, if you want to eat, I will feed you. And he fed them manna, which was kind of a wafer, but a short phrase for it is bread. And he would feed them these honey-dew bread wafer kinds of things from the sky. But he told them, I will feed you, but you are not to store up any of this for tomorrow. If you store up anything for tomorrow, what's going to happen to it? It's going to go bad. It's going to rot. Why would he do that to his people? Because he wanted them to trust him tomorrow just as much as he trusts them today. And that is to rely on him to provide your bread. Now, there's a reason for it. He's a good father. Always keep that in mind. There's a reason for it. Because these daily practices of learning to rely on God to eat would remind you that when you enter the promised land and you are eating from trees you didn't plant and living in houses you didn't build, it would be so easy to forget God. But if you've developed the spiritual habits of relying on him for everything and you need him like you need air, then it will help you to remember. So the story was, I will provide the bread for the day. Let me ask you. You may, spiritually speaking, or physically, be living paycheck to paycheck right now. If that's your physical situation, this speaks to that. If that's not your physical situation, if that's your spiritual situation, that is somehow you're living spiritual paycheck to spiritual paycheck. That is, you desperately need an encouraging message at some point during the week because the other days are just full of misery for you. And you're just hanging on every day to whatever faith you can grab onto. If that's where you are, listen to this message. Trust that God will provide just enough bread to last the day. And if he does, blessed be the name of the Lord. Remember that he taught us to pray. Lord, give us this day our what? Daily bread. That's really interesting. And I'm sure that also is a reference to the manna story of the Old Testament. The prayer is not, Lord, the normal prayer, the average prayer is not, Lord, give us an abundance. Because it's possible that getting an abundance might make you forget God. The daily prayer is that God will provide our daily needs. And it makes us pray every day. And it causes us to recognize his goodness every day. So the first vignette is if you are living paycheck to paycheck, hanging on to a thread, and you got 24 hours, and then 24 hours, and then 24 hours of needing him to remind you to hang on. Trust that he does, trust that he can, and trust that he will provide the bread for the day. Let's skip the next story. We'll come back to it. Look in verse 30. Here we have our second bread story, and you know bread's in this story. This is where Jesus feeds the 5,000. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." By the way, desolate place and rest are key Old Testament terms that remind you of the wilderness. And many were coming and going. They had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. In Numbers, Moses looks at the people in the desert and says to God, "I need help, for they are like sheep without a shepherd." And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." This is really interesting. The disciples specifically go out of their way to say, send them home so they can take care of themselves. In the Greek, it's emphatic. Let they themselves find food for themselves to eat. Jesus picks up on that. And in the Greek, this is emphatic. That is, he says you twice. The you is implied in the verb, and then he also adds the noun. So what he says is, you yourselves give them something to eat. What do you mean they themselves provide for themselves? You yourselves give them something to eat. And they said to him, do you expect us to buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? Do you really expect us to provide bread to hungry people? Well, you realize that just in the story we just read, he gave them power over demons. He gave them power over unclean things. He gave them power to work God's miracles. And he taught them that God will provide the bread they need every day. But they didn't get it through their heads that they were supposed to be funnels, vessels, through which God would do the same thing for others. So in verse 38, Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they go and they look and they say, 5 loaves and 2 fish. You know there's not a throwaway line in all of the Bible, especially when you have a small book like Mark. The next verse says, he commanded them to sit down in the groups on the green grass, and they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Maybe Mark is just trying to be methodical and keep up with the numbers, maybe. But it's interesting that when the children of Israel in the Old Testament sat down in groups for Moses to judge them, they sat in groups of hundreds and 50s. We have language that reminds us of God taking care of his people in a desolate place with sheep without a shepherd, and it's God who always provides. And he commanded them to do this, and they sat down in groups, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven. He said a blessing. He broke the bread and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Remember me telling you the definition of a commentator is someone with too much time on their hands? They always have interesting thoughts in some of these books, and sometimes you're not sure where they get them from. I've heard them talk about, the 5 loaves, you've heard of the 5 books of Moses. Okay, well, fine, maybe. But I like this one. The apostles doubt that they have the power that God wants to give them to provide for the people. And they assume people have to provide for themselves, which is the very thing Jesus is trying to teach them not to do. So instead, God provides enough to feed them more than they could possibly imagine. And how many baskets do they have left over? 12. How many apostles are there? 12. I wonder if that was one parting gift for every apostle. Here, next time you doubt, why don't you think about this as you take it home? I also wonder if it rotted the next day. I don't know. But it says here are 12 baskets full. Here's enough for every one of you doubting Thomases. I also wonder if whenever the apostles called Thomas doubting Thomas, he'd say, hey, remember the baskets? We're all in the same boat here. 5,000 men. I already said sometimes you may be living paycheck to paycheck, and in those moments, remember that God provides your daily bread. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Sometimes you are experiencing a windfall like no other, either physically or spiritually. You are living in abundance. And if that's your situation, blessed be the name of the Lord. There are times when God does that. There are people who are incredibly blessed in terms of financial resources. Or maybe you're just living at a time when everything you're asking God in prayer seems to be getting answered with a yes. Or maybe you're just saying, I can't imagine more blessings in my life than what I have right now. Whatever your situation is, if it's a situation of abundance, remember that the Lord is the one who provides it. I know it might seem ironic, but this is the one that has the most potential to mislead. You know that the proverb says, Lord, don't make me so poor that I hate you, or so rich that I forget you. It's a real challenge there. So if you are living at a time when you have more than you can possibly imagine, remember it's God who provides your bread. God says that to the children of Israel in the desert. When you enter the promised land and you eat food you didn't plant and live in houses you didn't build, don't forget that I led you up out of Egypt. I led you through the wilderness, and I've given you all these things. Sometimes God provides more than you could possibly imagine. Let's go back to the John the Baptist story. It is possible to read too much into texts, and I pray that I don't. No, the word bread is not in the story. But I can't help but notice that this story takes place during a party. And if you notice, there is a party going on when the king says, ask for anything and I'll give you up to half my kingdom. And she doesn't just say, I want the head of John the Baptist. She says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a what? On a platter. And what do you put on a platter at a party? You put food. Sometimes God will give you just enough bread to last the day, and if he does, blessed be the name of the Lord. Sometimes he'll give you more than you could possibly imagine, and in those cases, blessed be the name of the Lord. And sometimes God calls upon you to be bread for the world. And in those moments, will you trust him, who knows all things, and say, blessed be the name of the Lord? We all want God to answer our prayers with a yes. We do. But every one of us is so grateful that when Jesus was in the garden and said, if there's any other way, let this cup pass, the Father answered with a no. It was the right answer. It saved the world. You may be in a situation in which you're wondering why God is not answering your prayers with a yes. You may wonder why you are suffering right now, why you have to be going through something you didn't ask to go through. And you wonder, Is it possible that even in this moment, instead of answering your prayer, he might be answering someone else's prayer? In how you deal with your situation might be the way God is letting them know that there is hope and there is joy and there is a Christian response to difficulty. And he's given you the blessing of being the sermon for others. I want to show you why I think this is Mark's sermon and not mine. Because now we come to the last story in the chapter. I thought you said there's a story about Jesus walking on the water. How are you going to get pulled bread out of this one? Well, it's there, but we'll get to it. I left you with Jesus intending to pass by them. Remember that? Something about that doesn't feel right, does it? I mean, the stories we read about God all through the Bible is our God sees us in our difficulty and he runs to us. I mean, he sent his son to die for us. How could he have intended to walk right on by people who are hurting and struggling in the midst of the storm? That sounds so opposite God. So I go to my shelf and I pull off my commentaries. That's what you do when you don't know what to do with this. And you start reading and you say, take the tension out of this text. And so I start reading them. And I start to realize these guys don't always know what they're talking about. The first one said, I'm not making this up. The guy's name is Bellhausen. Jesus wants to run to the other side of the lake so that when the boat lands there, he can jump out and surprise them. He got paid to write that commentary. Another one puts words that many of us think when we first see this line. Let's just face it, he says. Jesus has not shown up to help his hurting people in the time of the storm. It sure looks that way. But there's some hidden hints that Mark has for us, some nuggets that he has hidden just below the surface. I want you to notice a couple of them. First, do you see that it was the fourth watch of the night? That's what my Bible says. Your version may say something different. Does someone have something different at verse 48? Shortly before dawn. The Jews counted their calendar starting in the evening, not the morning. And a watch of the night is that 3 hours? Yeah, watch of the night is 3 hours. So you start at 6 p.m. First watch of the night, 6 to 9. Second is 9 to 12. Third is 12 to 3. Fourth watch of the night is 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. It's dawn. I find that interesting. In the Psalms, did I say that wrong? Okay. In the Psalms, one of the psalmists writes and says, early in the morning I rise to seek thee. In the fourth watch of the night, you find me. It's not a coincidence that the resurrection of Jesus happens early in the morning on the first day of the week, just before dawn. In the Old Testament and in the New Testament, fourth watch of the night is actually the time not when God runs away, but when God shows up. When Moses keeps the water back by holding his arm out, if you remember, he does it all night. It doesn't show that in the movie. Heston doesn't hold that out all night. But the text, it did it all night. And it was in the fourth watch of the night when the water crashed down and over all the chariot wheels. That's not when God runs away when his people are in the midst of a storm. It's when he shows up. Second hint. Jesus says three things in verse 50. He says, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Take courage and don't be afraid are the exact phrases God says to Moses And Moses says to Joshua, when they're dealing with the difficulties of where is God in the desert, take courage and don't be afraid are God's words of reassurance when he shows up in the Old Testament. And the phrase in the middle that's translated in my Bible as "it is I" can also be translated as "I am." God's name for himself when he tells Moses in the burning bush, you want to know who I am? Tell Pharaoh, I am has sent you. So the three phrases on the lips of Jesus are the words on the lips of God when his people are in trouble. Third, in the Old Testament, the only character in the whole Old Testament who walks on the sea is God. He rides on the waves of the sea because the sea represents chaos, and that's God bringing order. All of that tells us that this sounds like a text, not when God runs away, but when God shows up, and I'm not done. It turns out, in Hebrew, there is a technical phrase for what it means when God reveals his glory. Are you ready for this? It's the phrase, to pass by. In the Old Testament, when Jacob is wrestling with the angel, the text says that the angel passed by him. We find out later, he says, I was wrestling with God. When Elijah comes to the edge of the cave and he says to God, God said, all these people, there's nobody bowing the knee to you anymore. I'm the only one that's left. And God says, step back for a second. And it says there's a strong wind and there's a fire and there's an earthquake, but God wasn't in any of those. And then a still small voice, but actually begins by saying, and God passed by him. That's the phrase that means God shows up and reveals his glory. This text is not saying that Jesus intended to forget about his hurting people in the midst of the storm. Just the opposite. This text means he intended to reveal the glory of God in the midst of the storm. On the day of the shooting, CNN and ABC and NBC all brought their cameras, and they already had the tagline ready because it was going to be a horrible week, and all the news was going to be terror, massacre, misery, evil in West Nickel mines. That was going to be the story. But almost immediately, the storyline began to change because the camera crew could overhear a grandfather of these murdered children saying to the mothers, remember, we must not think evil of this man. Money began to pour in to help this hurting Amish community. And what did they do with it? They split the money in half. And the mothers of the murdered children marched arm in arm to the home of the widow of the shooter, Marie Roberts, knocked on her door and said, you must be suffering as much as we are. Here, take this. What can we do for you? True story. Members of the Amish community whose own children and nieces and nephews had been murdered days before attended and spoke at Carl Roberts' funeral, asking God's forgiveness on the man that murdered their children. And ABC and NBC and CNN changed their tagline. And the story that went out all over the world was Amazing Grace. To think that God could show up and reveal his glory in the midst of the storm is what Mark is trying to get you to see. It's not just when God provides in abundance. It's not just when he provides enough to get through the day. It's even when he calls upon you to be bread for the world, whatever your circumstance. Believe that God can and will show up, and even in this, whatever this is, he can reveal his glory and tell his story. I'm almost done. Verse 51. And he got into the boat, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Verse 52. Because they did not understand about the bread. Do you see how Mark ties it all together with a bow? How did the disciples not know? How did they not understand that no matter what they're facing, God will give them just what they need? If they had been paying attention throughout the chapter, they would have known. God provides your bread. He gives you just what you need. He gives the world just what it needs. So whatever my situation is, I can say, blessed be the name of the Lord. This is the gospel according to Mark. Let's pray. God, we love you. We don't know what to ask for. We think we know. We look at our situations and we think we know what we need, but you know what we need. And you know what we can handle. And you know what the world around us needs. And we ask, not our will, but yours be done. Give us this day our daily bread, and whatever that is, may it bring glory to you. God, speak your word through us. Tell your story. Let the gospel be seen in our life, and give us confidence and hope that in the midst of our storms, you do not run away. You run to us. May we see you at work, and may you use us to tell your glory as we cry out to you, and you remind us not to be afraid. In Jesus' name, amen.